What is up, my people? Welcome to another one. Today we will be talking about movies, actors, and in particular, action stars or action heroes. And the main thing is a post that I saw on X that read what the woke culture has done to action stars or something, some shit like that. So it was a political based post, not necessarily an art based post that has anything to do with art or with acting or with the way things are actually going. And this is a very disingenuous post, in my opinion, because these heroes that you see at the bottom, supposedly action heroes, they're not really action heroes. They're superhero actors, right? Or actors that have been casted for superhero roles. But none of these guys that you see here at the bottom, are actually action heroes. The most popular here is Robert Downey Jr. And Robert Downey Jr. He's never been an action hero. Even when he became Iron Man, and he became famous for playing Iron Man, he never was considered an action hero. And most of these superhero roles, um, they don't pick action heroes for them. It's very rare that they do, and when they do, it's way later down the line. Like, for example, Dwayne the Rock Johnson playing Shazam, or Black Adam. Right, that was way down the line, and it was there was a lot of problems with Dwayne and what he wanted to do, what he didn't want to do, or what he wanted to participate with and not participate with. That's one of the problems with an action star, is that a lot of them have big egos, and their egos kind of get in the way of performing. But yeah, this is a disingenuous post, because in today's era, our action heroes are actually, from my personal view, it's Keanu Reeves, uh, Tom Cruise, and uh, Iko Ayawa, something like that. Iko Ayawa. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Iku Ayawa is another one. And believe it or not, he's on the rise right now, but he may be, depending on if Tom Cruise fades away or not. You know, believe it or not, Brad Pitt, who's on the rise as becoming maybe this decade's action hero. And that's just my personal opinion, because it seems like he's pushing for that. So he just made a movie called F1, the movie, and it was a really good movie. You guys should go check it out. It's definitely worth watching. It takes it back to the old school action flick, and the way they used to make that. And you could tell that he's pushing for that. He's also about to star in a movie, later on this year. So it seems like he's pushing for that number one spot for this decade's action hero. But let's take a look at what an action hero actually is. Number one, and number two, um, you know, first of all, like I said, these actors that play heroes, they're not action heroes. They're just actual actors or actors, and usually those are the guys that qualify for these type of roles, because they're more about the acting, than the physical attraction. Like a lot of these guys at the top here, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Jean Claude Van Damme, and Dolph Lundgren. These guys, they, mainly focus on the body, right? On sculpting their body, and performing actual stunts, and doing their own action scenes, and picking up things that are heavy that you're not supposed to be picking up, stuff like that. Or doing the splits, like for example Jean-Claude Van Damme, or doing this crazy awesome kick that nobody could do or something. This is what these guys focus on the most, and the acting is secondary, right? If you notice, Arnold and Sylvester Stallone, they're not very much. They don't have the gift of gab. They're, pretty much like they can't speak well. Kind of like me. But they're a little bit more extreme because sometimes you don't understand what they're saying, like, and shit like that. So, but it doesn't really matter, um, because their strengths are elsewhere, right? But when it comes to like for example Robert Downey Jr., who's famous for playing Iron Man, his main ability is that he's witty and he's quick with his jokes, and he's funny. He's a funny guy, and he also has a lot of swag. Okay, he has that Robert Downey Jr. swag. So most of these actors at the bottom, they qualify as swag actors. That's what I call them. I call them swag actors, meaning that their main attraction is that they have this, kind of like an attitude, or a personality, that people like and that people are attracted to, that demands attention from the public. And this is what most of the time superhero um, movies like, right? And a good example is Robert Pattinson, right? He's not an action hero. He never was. He might never be an action hero because he's just not that type of actor. His stuff is more, like I said, like an actor. And even to a certain extent, he has that smoldering look in his eyes, especially from the Twilight days, to where he falls into the category of what I like to call a swag actor, right? Um, so like I said, none of these guys that play superhero roles are ever, actual action heroes, because that's not what hero movies go for. So like I said, the Post in its essence is disingenuous because these aren't action heroes of today. I already mentioned who I think are the action heroes of today. It's Tom Cruise. Um, who else did I mention? Brad Pitt is kind of pushing towards that, right? And Keanu Reeves, right? Keanu Reeves. So let's go back to the very beginning, right, of the action star, from what I can remember what an action star is. Okay, and what we were thinking back then, and what America liked to see in those days, and what we're where we're at now and where we're going, and also like to talk about where the martial arts actor had his heyday or its peak, and hopefully where we're gonna get another one. Um, so, anyways, the very first action, or like action hero that I could think about is Steve McQueen, right? And this is the first guy that I remember, thinking, okay, this guy is an action hero, and he falls into the category of swag or old swag. So there's two categories in my opinion, or that I've made up personally for my list, is young swag and old swag. And usually for action heroes, or for action movies, they will usually pick older actors with swag, right? And that's basically what they had. They didn't have a lot of muscles. They weren't good at anything in particular. They didn't have a martial arts that they were good at, like Bruce Lee or whatever. But what they did have is they had attitude, and they had style, and they had um, that presence that demanded attention. And Steve McQueen was one of the first ones that I can remember. Sean Connery, and these guys are all from the 60s and 70s. But Sean Connery is another guy, right? That has the same type of style and the same type of presence that demands attention. So he not necessarily was ever muscular or attractive in that kind of sense. He was more attractive in the sense of his presence and in the sense of his swag. So this is what I call the decade or the 2 decades of swag actors or swag action heroes. Right. Clint Eastwood was another one. Right. And I don't know why they're sending me shit right now. But anyways, Clint Eastwood, right, is another guy who became famous, not as a young actor, but as an older actor, making movies, abroad in Italy, and that's how he became, more popular and it also gave way to the first kind of like competition or friendly competition between two actors. And at the time, it either was rumored or it was a fact that Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson had a bit of a rivalry together. And they would put out these movies where they were measuring the size of their guns, to see whose gun was bigger. And I mean, you guys let me know who won the I think Clint Eastwood came up with the what is it, the Schofield or something like that, and and Charles Bronson had some kind of elephant killer or some shit. I forgot what it was, but it was like a friendly competition between two actors, and this was pretty much the first one that happened. I personally think Clint Eastwood won, simply because he still made movies long after his decade ended, and he became a director, and he became a producer, he became all kinds of stuff in the business. And I think that um, is way more than Charles Bronson did. But Charles Bronson, even though he didn't come out on top of his decade, he made a great influence in the acting community. And that is that he was the first guy who showed his muscles and became famous for being very muscular and being very just showing his muscles, and made it about that, and made it a habit to work out every day and keep up with his physical appearance. When in the past, most of the actors from his generation, they really didn't care too much about that. Most actors were very skinny or skinny fat, and they really didn't care about maintaining big muscles like Charles Bronson did. And Charles Bronson made a career out of that. I'm sorry about that. and and he was in my opinion, from what I can remember, he was the first to do so. He was the first to make a career out of, being the strong dude, the guy that could take off his shirt in front of the camera and flex his muscles for an action scene. When before it wasn't like that. It was all about swag, and it was all about charm, and it was all about looking the part, but not necessarily being the part. And of course, around this time, Bruce Lee was also making an impact. The reason I didn't put Bruce Lee in this list here is because Bruce Lee made an impact into what was coming later, but he didn't necessarily do much in that decade. I think Bruce Lee was going to be the future, and was gonna be a big star in the 80s. But unfortunately, his career was cut off short. Because what you're gonna learn here in this video is that a lot of actors towards the end of a decade they get a hit, and they unexpectedly become popular. And then when they unexpectedly become popular, the next decade that comes after is the one that they usually take over. And I believe that that's what happened with Bruce Lee. I think Bruce Lee was just now kicking in the door in the late 60s. I mean, the late 70s. And he was about to be, the 80s were about to be his. He was about to, in my opinion, take over Hollywood and bring forth martial arts films. But that didn't happen. And what we got instead of that is a bunch of people influenced by Bruce Lee and Charles Bronson. And that's the 80s. And we started getting Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's probably the best of that era, of that generation. Because he had the best movies. And of course, there was a friendly competition between him and Sylvester Stallone. So we still keep that tradition that we had in the 60s with Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson. So now we have it with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone in the 80s. And and it's debated who was the best in the 80s. Some people said Arnold, some people said Sylvester. You guys let me know in the comments what you guys think. I think, I think Arnold won the 80s, but Sylvester Stallone, transcended the 80s. And he went past that. He went to the 90s, and he's even making some movies now. And you're gonna realize in this video that he comes back, and makes these movies in each decade that kind of grab the attention of people. But as far as what decade was his decade, I would have to say that it was the 80s and parts of the 90s. Even though the 90s belonged to someone else that I'm gonna mention. Another actor from the 80s that took off, and also because of Bruce Lee, was Chuck Norris. And I believe Chuck Norris has the most movies in the 80s. I think he does. And he was popular not just here in the US, he was popular worldwide. So he was a very popular action hero. Who's kind of, in a way, forgotten or underrated. But he, in my opinion, I'm not sure. I have to go check. I have to make notes. This is something that people keep telling me that I should make notes or whatever, which I will in the future. But for right now, I'm just making mental notes. But Chuck Norris has a lot of movies in the 80s, and they're not half bad. I mean, most of them are pretty good, and they have good plots, good stories, and he's just a good all-around action hero, in my personal opinion. And Dolph Lundgren, which pretty much owes his career to Sylvester Stallone, but he definitely, was a thing, in the 80s. And he definitely took off in the 80s. Of course, he didn't do much after that. It was P-Punk. He kind of just stuck around in the 80s. And then past that, he kind of became kind of like the bad guy, or the supporting actor. But he in the 80s he was pretty popular, and he even at one point, I think he played the He-Man in a role. I don't know if I have a picture of that, but yeah, the 80s. The one thing you'll notice about the 80s is that that decade was about muscles, and there was only really one martial artist, right, in the bunch, which is Chuck Norris. And the rest of them were, kind of these muscular guys, that just looked the part. And of course, they did do some of their own stunts, but it wasn't like Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris was a better choreographer, and he was just, his fight scenes were a little bit more realistic, in my opinion, than something like Rocky Balboa or, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And but yeah, so what you notice is that muscles, and that was what was attractive in that era. But of course that became less popular as time went by, and people started realizing that's kind of corny, it's kind of cheesy. And Hollywood realized that, and they started to make fun of that type of hero. And that's when you start seeing a bunch of spoofs, you start seeing a bunch of people making fun of the action hero. Even Sylvester Stallone, started making fun of himself with a lot of movies like Kindergarten Cop, or one where he's pregnant. I forgot which one that was. By the way, if that movie, what's the name of that movie where he gets pregnant? It's called He's the Man or something like that. I forgot. But yeah, he gets pregnant in that movie. But anyways, if that movie would have came out right now, people would go crazy. Yeah, they'll lose their shit. They talk about woke shit and whatever, and people lose their shit, bro. People are way too sensitive now, and way more conservative than we used to be, to a point to where we can't really see anything on TV that's a little bit different, because we start thinking that it's evil and woke or whatever. So things used to be a lot more different back then, and we were a lot more free to come up with new ideas. And now we're not that way no more. Now we have to stay in these certain lanes. And mainly it's because of the people. I think the people complaining about that kind of stuff is what made it to where, directors and writers don't want to push the envelope too much. They don't want to write about things like that anymore, because they see how the American people react to it, and they're kind of scared of doing that now. And the only way they push it is through horror, right? They push it through horror. So horror is still, one of the avenues where artists in the film industry can push the envelope. And the reason they could do that there is because people in the U.S. are okay with being scared. They're okay with gore. They're okay with blood and violence. They're not okay with sex. They're not okay with people enjoying themselves through sex or stuff that resemble love. They're just not okay with that, and that's the truth. Because if you notice, I mean, we're okay with a lot of gory stuff, a lot of crazy blood and torture. The Terrifier is a big deal now. But if they see somebody enjoying themselves, in some kind of way that's unconventional, um, it's not good, for Americans at least. And that's something that I've noticed personally. You can't be doing that here in the States. But anyways, moving on here to the next decade, which is the 90s. Now, a lot of people say that Jean-Claude Van Damme is an 80s action star. And the truth is that he's more of a 90s action star. He, I think only 2 or 3 of his movies were in the 80s, right? And they were big. They were a big deal. I forgot if it was. I think it was a Cyborg was in the 80s, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Bloodsport and Kickboxer, or maybe just Bloodsport. But the point is that these two films gave him a cult following, and these weren't actual like mainstream films. These were like, from what I can remember, they were like movies that people just knew about, and people just passed around, and it's pretty much a cult classic. That's what it is, and that's how Jean-Claude Van Damme got his fame. He got his fame through word of mouth and through people just loving his shit. And then after that, in the 90s, that's when he became popular with more mainstream martial arts films like Time Cop, Double Impact, Street Fighter, the animated, I mean, not the animated, the live action. Um, so many other mainstream shit happened in the 90s, but that was because of his cult following that he built in the 80s. But in my opinion, his fame was in the 90s, the early 90s and mid 90s. And a little bit of the 2000s as well, but just very little. And then he just faded away into obscurity. He kind of had a little bit of a comeback. But even though, the 90s were pretty much his, he did, in my opinion, he didn't win the 90s. Steven Seagal was with his main competition, right? But this was the only era that I believe both of the guys that competed for the number one spot didn't make it. And the guy who actually beat them both was Jackie Chan. And Jackie Chan, he beat them through just sheer outworking them. He just made more movies than them. And he was just better at it. He did his own stunts, and he did a crazy amount of stunts. So he blew him out of the water, because while they were over there competing against each other, he was just pushing out these movies like crazy. But yeah, if you think about it, Arnold versus Sylvester, both of those guys pretty much made it out of their decade, and still became popular through the 90s, but the reason they weren't, I didn't put them as part of the 90s, is because the 90s belongs, in my opinion, to the martial arts film, and the martial arts actors. And this was the first decade that they kind of pushed away the muscle bound guys for guys that were smaller and they could do shit. They could do shit like the splits and do crazy kicks and shit like that. And this was part of the decade where Wesley Snipes was a big deal too. And there were so many martial arts actors that just came over, like Donnie Yen and Xiao Yun Fat. So many actors from China that gave us a lot of great films. And some of them broke into the mainstream as well, like Jet Li. He did very well. But I still think, like I said, the one who beat them all and who came out on top was Jackie Chan, and he even went beyond the 90s. And like I said, Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger were still making films, but in my opinion, the martial arts films there were so many and so much that they were just better and more popular in the 90s. But yeah, that's what I think. But let's talk about the early 2000s, and that's when we go back to muscles. We go back to muscle bound guys, and I mean, right now he doesn't look that muscular, but trust me, he starts getting crazy. A lot of these guys start using steroids, and they start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they don't even look human anymore. Now, Ben Diesel lately, he's been letting himself go, but in this decade, we went back to muscles, but also to a mixture of muscles and actual martial arts. So we kind of tried to combine the two into something a little bit more attractive. I'm sorry, guys. Let me just do something here. Something that looks a little bit more attractive, at least to the viewer. They wanted to go back to a little bit more of a quote unquote alpha male type of thing, or the traditional look of an alpha male, which I think is stupid. But anyways, that's what people think. And yeah, so we went back to a little bit more muscle with Ben Diesel. Ben Diesel pretty much owned, the early 2000s with the Fast and the Furious shit. And then in the 2010s, he also did a lot there with the fame that he caused here in the early 2000s. And pretty much there was a bit of a competition between him and Dwayne The Rock Johnson. Dwayne The Rock Johnson he was a wrestler, one of my personal favorite wrestlers of all time. By the way, R.I.P. Hulk Hogan. You know, he I think he died yesterday or somewhere. I think it was yesterday. And I was never really a big fan of Hulk Hogan. I think he was the first wrestling star that tried to become an action star. And you know, it's crazy that he's gone. And I did actually enjoy, because I was a little kid. I was like 6 years old, 6, 7 years old at the time, and I used to love Hulk Hogan movies. I thought they were funny. I thought they were fun, you know, and I was entertained by them. Now, of course, I wouldn't watch them again now because I think they're very corny now and they're very stupid. But Hulk Hogan tried to break through in that way. You know, he tried to become a superstar, and he was the first to attempt it. Now, I don't think he was very successful in it because most of those movies are trash. But you know, R.I.P. to Hulk Hogan. You know, I was personally more of a macho man. I said macho man fan. I like Ric Flair as well. You know, but I really started watching the WWE when The Rock was a thing, you know. And The Rock was the opposite of Hulk Hogan, because The Rock, when I came around to watching The Rock, he was a heel. He was a bad guy, and he was pretty much a bully. He would pick on people and talk shit about reporters. He was a bad guy, but he was a charming bad guy, and then he turned into a good guy later on, and which was the opposite of Hulk Hogan. Because I remember watching Hulk Hogan movies and being like, oh man, Hulk Hogan, he's awesome or whatever. You know, I was a stupid kid. And then watching him go heel in WWE with the NWO and shit like that, I was like, no, Hulk, no, don't do that. So Hulk Hogan was my first letdown as a kid. You know, to where I'm like, my heroes could become villains, you know. And for me, Hulk Hogan wasn't necessarily a wrestling hero. He was more of an action, for a little bit of time. He was more of an action hero, believe it or not, because it's like, I liked his movies when I was a kid. You know, later on, of course, I immediately grew out of it because when you're a kid, you take things too seriously, you know. And watching him become a heel actually did affect me in thinking like, damn, that guy's crazy evil or whatever. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I took that shit seriously. You know, I took it personal when he went heel, and he started doing a bunch of shit to Rey Mysterio, and I was like, no, Rey Mysterio, because in my eyes, Rey Mysterio was me, a little short brown guy, and and you know, so I didn't take shit like that lightly when I was a kid. So I immediately, you know, shunned Hulk Hogan from my life and became a fan of The Rock, because The Rock, in my eyes, was the bully, and he was a brown guy. You know, he's Samoan, he's not Mexican, but he was definitely, you know, as far as shades goes, he was a brown guy. And I was like, oh, brown guys could be bullies too. So it's kind of weird, you know, it's kind of weird psychological shit that goes on in my brain. But, you know, getting back to the topic of today, you know, in the early 2000s, The Rock tried to make it into Hollywood with the Scorpion King. And the Scorpion King was not a success. In my personal opinion, it was a very bad movie. A lot of people like it, actually. I thought it was lame. I thought it was interesting to see him as an action hero and to see him outside of wrestling, because my whole life I've seen this guy as a wrestler. And you know, wrestling is a martial arts, guys. So whether you like to believe it or not, it is a martial arts. Um, at least I think it is. Now, is it a traditional martial arts like, for example, kung fu, karate, even boxing? No, it's not. But it's definitely a martial arts. They're definitely hitting each other in there. They're definitely doing shit that works. Like if I do a suplex on you, you think, yeah, that's not gonna break your spine, or your back. If I do a power driver, you think that's not gonna fuck your spine up? Like, come on, like think about it. Like these moves are real. Now they're hard to perform, and they modify it in order for them not to kill each other in the ring. But if they were actually doing these moves, if they were actually punching you, they'd kill you, like straight up. and wrestling is based on a real martial arts. Like professional wrestling is based off of catch wrestling and old school, tactics, wrestling tactics. Um, it's based off of that, and it was modified to be less dangerous so that people won't die and lose their arms all the time. That's why we have professional wrestling today. Now, of course, it was been watered down through the times, and we have a lot of showmanship more than usual, and it's not as dangerous as it used to be back in the British Islands. Um, but it's definitely, there's definitely still has elements of violence in there. But what I'm trying to say is, Dwayne the Rock Johnson falls into this weird category of a martial arts muscle man, which is a mixture of someone that's muscular but is also able to do some of the fighting, able to do his own stunts, and able to do his own shit. Okay, so and it's similar to Jean-Claude Van Damme, because Jean-Claude Van Damme, he didn't have a bad looking body. He wasn't skinny, he wasn't small. He wasn't the biggest either, but he was somewhere in the middle, right? But then you got Dwayne The Rock Johnson coming over, and he could do the moves. He also looks muscular, and that brought forth in the early 2000s an era of a bunch of wrestling stars trying to become superstars in Hollywood. And it brought Stone Cold Steve Austin, John Cena. All of these guys tried to follow the example of Dwayne The Rock Johnson and become big Hollywood superstars. But unlike Hulk Hogan, The Rock was actually successful in doing it. This is also in the early 2000s. Actually, this was the late 90s. But I still say it's the early 2000s because that's when Blade 2 came out and Trinity. And even though Trinity wasn't that good, I still like Trinity. But Wesley Snipes, he did this movie back in 1998, I believe. And in 1998, he made this movie called Blade. And at the time, similar to Jean-Claude Van Damme, the movie was not that popular. I mean, it was popular, but it was underground popular. It was a movie for the people, and the people took off with it and made it what it is today. And yeah, man, I mean, I personally think this is where the superhero movie started. This is what made people believe that superhero movies actually had a future. Because before that, it was just Batman and Superman. Batman and Superman were the movies, the go-to movies for people, right? And, past that, people didn't really fuck with superhero movies that much. So, but with Blade, they saw an opportunity. then they saw that comic books actually had good stories and unique stories than what we've seen in Hollywood for a while. Um, but then in the 2000s, that's when he took off. In my opinion, the popularity of Blade took off with Blade 2. Now, this is also the renaissance of old swag. You know, and old swag, like I said, it started in the first, our first action heroes were old swag guys, meaning just these old guys that look like badasses and kicked ass. You know, like for example, Charles Bronson, Clint Eastwood, and stuff like that. And one of the guys that made it to where everybody wanted to do it was Liam Neeson with his action role in Taken. And now it's become an iconic film, and everybody quotes it, and everybody wants to be like Liam Neeson, you know, and including, of course, John Wick. What do you think, John Wick? John Wick is not an original idea. John Wick is an idea taken from Taken and made into a franchise. And of course, Liam Neeson, after the early 2000s, the 2010s was where Liam Neeson took off. And he made a bunch of movies, you know, based on pretty much the same character, which is the guy from Taken. An old guy who kicks ass, you know, who still knows how to kick ass, and he has a particular set of skills. And you can't beat him because he's just a badass. And you think he's not a badass, but he's a badass. He's more than just an old guy. And the same thing happened with John Wick. You know, he's a guy, he gets pissed off because of a dog, and he goes on a killing spree. Which, by the way, people say Superman is bad for yelling at Lex Luthor for a dog, but this guy killed the whole he killed the whole mob, dude. But anyways, and the Tom Cruise came back, you know, and he decided to do a bunch of stuff in the 2010s. And you know, towards the end of that, he came up with Top Gun Maverick, which in my opinion is one of the best action movies of this generation. And he's up there, man. He's right now, he has about 2 movies in the 2020s. So the 2020s aren't over yet. So it's either gonna be Tom Cruise, Kiakui, which is the only guy doing stuff for martial arts right now, for martial arts fighters. So if you notice, there's 2 decades now, the 2010s and the 2020s, that are pretty much dedicated to the old swag guy, to the old swag action star. Of course, Tom Cruise, he's one of these hybrids who is an old swag actor, but also does his own stunts. Right, so he's one of these, like I said, like hybrids, kind of like The Rock Johnson and Jean-Claude Van Damme. But Tom Cruise falls into the category of old swag slash you know, like actual doers, you know. But the thing is, he's not a martial artist, so it's kind of like hard to kind of categorize Tom Cruise. But the only one that's holding it up for traditional martial artists is Kyo Awai, or whatever his name is. Iko Awai. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong, but yeah, he's the only one holding it down for martial artists right now. With his movie Raid, he pretty much changed the game. A lot of people are gonna try to emulate that style, that chaotic style of action. And he's the one who did that. Okay, and he's the only one who's doing something different than the John Wicks. You know, because the John Wicks, they took over. I call them the John Wicks because everybody wants to be fighting like John Wick, and it's been happening for now 2 decades. which is crazy. In 2 decades, we haven't seen a different style of martial arts in the John Wick style, and we've seen nothing but old swag fighters. I mean, old swag actors. You know, with Liam Neeson, uh, Keanu Reeves, and Tom Cruise. Okay, those are our action stars right now. It's not, um, the heroes, like the superheroes for hero movies. That's not it. That's not our heroes. These are our action heroes right now, and I'm cool with that or whatever. But you know, the cycle that I was talking about, it's missing martial arts. That's what I'm trying to say. Martial arts is not there. We don't have a martial arts era anymore. We haven't had one. My hope and prediction is that the end of the 2020s is going to bring forth a good martial arts action star that's going to bring us to the 2030s. And in the 2030s is where we're going to have a renaissance of martial arts films here in America, hopefully. But we're just going to have to see. As of right now, the race for the 2020s is going to be up to Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, and maybe Denzel Washington. I don't know. But like I said, it's old swag characters. These are our action stars right now. It's old swag. We're back to old swag. We're back to the beginning. And usually what comes after that is supposed to be muscular again. Because like I said, we skipped the generation of martial arts. So, the 2020s was supposed to be a martial arts renaissance, in my opinion. If we're going by the cycle that I'm painting here, the 2020s was supposed to be that martial arts renaissance. We're supposed to get another Jean-Claude Van Damme. We're supposed to get, and we don't have that. The only guy we have is Iko Awani. That's the only guy we have. And yes, he's influencing film for sure. If you've seen the movie, there's a new movie on Netflix, Havoc, I believe it's called. If you've seen Havoc, that's influenced by Iko Awani. So what I'm trying to say is that we need another martial arts in the Renaissance because we haven't had one since the 90s. And my hope is that the kids from Karate Kid start springing out with their own movies separately, martial arts movies separately, and they become the future of the 2030s. And that'll be where we see most of our martial arts renaissance coming from. But we're just gonna have to see, guys, what the future holds. Let me know in the comments who you think is gonna win this race for the 2020s. Is it gonna be Brad Pitt, or is it gonna be Tom Cruise, or maybe Denzel Washington, who has a bunch of Equalizer movies? But anyways, that is gonna be it for today, guys. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys later.